He came to watch his son graduate, carrying nothing but a letter and an old uniform. They told him the front row wasn't for men like him, but six strangers stood up when no one else did. And when his son took the stage, the truth silenced the entire room. Stay with us to find out what happened next, and don't forget to subscribe. Pendleton, Oregon, 2023. The morning air was sharp with frost, the kind that clung to old window panes and turned every breath into mist. Inside a modest trailer on the edge of town, Thomas Andrews moved with quiet precision. His hands, rough from decades of work and war, folded his faded army dress jacket with reverence. The fabric, though worn, was clean and pressed. Each crease held weight, not just from age but from memory. On the table beside him lay a small envelope, slightly bent at the corners, as if it had been opened and read more times than it should have been. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper. No embellishments, no flourish, just simple blue ink and unmistakable intent. It said everything he needed to hear. He read it again slowly, letting each word settle before folding the paper along its familiar crease and tucking it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The trailer was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a wall clock that hadn't chimed in years. Thomas stood for a moment, taking in the silence. There was no ceremony to his departure, no one to see him off. He reached for the old duffel bag he had carried through more than one deployment, now packed with only the essentials: shaved kit, clean socks, and a photograph of a boy who once wore braces and asked too many questions about medals. He laced up his boots, the same ones he'd worn on long marches and muddy roads, now polished the best he could manage. He pulled on his coat, adjusted the collar, and stepped outside into the cold. The town was just beginning to stir. Lights blinked on behind curtains. A delivery truck rumbled down Main Street, and the hills beyond the town line were still dusted with early snow. Thomas didn't own a car. He didn't need one. He had mapped the route days in advance, bus to Salem, train to Forest Grove, then on foot to the college campus. It would take most of the day, maybe longer with delays. That didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the seat. First row, as the note had said, not because it was close to the stage, but because his son had placed him there. Not in the program, not in the official list, but in his heart. And for Thomas Andrews, that was a place worth traveling for. The campus of George Fox University in Forest Grove had been transformed for the occasion. Banners bearing the school's crest flapped gently in the late morning breeze. White folding chairs stretched in neat rows across the trimmed lawn. Bouquets of flowers adorned every post, and signs with student names printed in bold fonts were staked along the walkways. Parents, grandparents, siblings, and friends moved about in coordinated celebration, dressed in varying degrees of formality, from floral dresses to stiff blazers with shiny buttons. The hum of conversation never ceased, hope, pride, joy, all rising together in the warm air. Near the main entrance, two volunteers checked guest lists against laminated name tags strung around necks with navy blue lanyards. Another usher guided guests toward sections labeled family, faculty, and honored attendees. Each area was marked by a velvet rope and a sense of belonging. People were directed, welcomed, congratulated. Through a quieter path near the edge of the courtyard, Thomas Andrews arrived alone. He had walked from the train station that morning, choosing the longer route to avoid sidewalks thick with students and alumni. He carried no balloons, wore no school colors, held no camera. Instead, his old army jacket, worn carefully over a white shirt and plain slacks, gave him the look of someone out of place, not because of dishevelment, but because of silence. He moved as though he'd rehearsed it in his mind a dozen times, rehearsed every step up to the moment he would reach the reserved seating and take the place his son had imagined for him. In his coat pocket, the folded letter remained close. The words written in his son's handwriting echoed with every step. First row, I want you there. That was the plan. That was what he held on to. As Thomas approached the front section, he could see the name tags clipped to each seat, neat cursive letters printed with formal titles. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, faculty guest. Dr. Nguyen, guest of provost. The air was cooler in the shade near the platform, and the low hum of a speaker test vibrated through the grass. Thomas walked toward the nearest gap in the rope. An usher stepped in smoothly, young, composed, clipboard in hand. She glanced briefly at the man in front of her and waited. Thomas reached into his coat, pulled out the letter. He extended it carefully, with the slow steadiness of someone offering something personal, something important. She didn't take it. Her eyes flicked over the worn paper, perhaps catching only the first few words, and then returned to her list. Her expression remained polite but firm. Without reading further, she gestured toward the rear general seating section. Thomas said nothing. He didn't protest. He looked down once at the letter, folded it again, and slipped it back into his pocket. He nodded once, more to himself than to her, and stepped back from the roped-off aisle. Guests behind him flowed around his retreat, eyes focused on their assigned chairs, conversations about school loans and summer jobs uninterrupted. He moved along the outer edge of the courtyard until he found a narrow space near one of the tall stone columns that framed the east perimeter of the event area. There were no chairs there, no programs laid out, no refreshments offered. It was a space between intentions, not meant for anyone in particular. From that vantage, he could see the stage well enough, though not the seats where his son would sit or the expressions on the faces of the speakers. But he didn't need a perfect view. He just needed to be present. He stood there, hands loosely folded behind his back, as the sun filtered through high branches. The jacket hung heavy on his shoulders. Around him, the crowd thickened. The celebration rose in volume. Bubbles floated from a toy wand in a child's hand. A camera flashed in the distance. The event was alive with motion and sound, and yet he remained still, a man holding space, not demanding it. Not far from him, a woman named Lauren Green sat in the fifth row, toward the center aisle. She had arrived early to claim a good seat to watch her niece graduate with a degree in nursing. At first, her attention had been on the graduates and the decorations, but something made her glance toward the edge of the plaza. She saw the man in the army jacket, not moving, not shifting like the others. Something about the way he stood, anchored yet unnoticed, made her blink and look again. He wasn't doing anything, and yet she couldn't look away. In the third row, closer to the stage, 6 men sat with straight backs and neutral expressions. Their suits varied in color and tailoring, but they all had the bearing of men trained to sit still for long periods, to scan peripheries without seeming to. One adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. Another tilted his head slightly toward the far side of the field. Each had seen Thomas the moment he arrived. They had seen him stopped, had seen him redirected, and now they watched as he stood alone, just outside the circle of celebration. None of them said a word. None leaned forward or whispered, but beneath the quiet there was awareness, shared and unspoken, because the man standing near the column had once stood in other places like that. Not outside of ceremonies, but outside of bunkers, outside of burning trucks, outside of walls with breach points, always just outside the line, and always watching. They recognized the posture not because it was dramatic, but because it was exact. The ceremony had not yet begun, and already something had shifted, not on stage, not in the program, but in the quiet corners where attention rarely lingers. Thomas didn't move. He didn't ask for anything. He simply remained, rooted not in stubbornness, but in promise. He had come for a seat, and though it had been denied, he had found a place to wait. The music began with bright brassy tones as the ceremony officially commenced. A string of student names echoed through the sound system, each one delivered with enthusiasm and followed by a corresponding burst of applause. Families leaned forward, searching for their loved ones in the rows of caps and gowns. Phones were raised, video started, and cameras flashed in jittery rhythms. The field of white chairs became a wave of activity. Parents rising for photos, siblings whispering excitedly, faculty members nodding with pride as their top students crossed the stage. Colorful sashes and cords caught the light. Mothers wept quietly behind sunglasses. Fathers pointed with pride. Everywhere, joy bloomed unrestrained. It was the kind of joy that moves quickly, attaches itself to names, to moments, to faces caught mid-smile in digital stillness. Yet just beyond the center of all that noise and light, Thomas Andrews stood motionless near the tall stone column. He watched the proceedings without expression, without any movement save the slow rise and fall of his chest. The roar of the crowd seemed to pass over him like wind over stone. It wasn't indifference that made him still. It was purpose. He had not come to celebrate the institution, nor to cheer with strangers. He had come for one name, one moment, one boy. Around him, no one paused. Guests continued to pass by, brushing past his boots without looking down. A few caught sight of the old army jacket and averted their eyes quickly, as if unsure whether it required acknowledgement or silence. Others didn't see him at all. To them, he was part of the background, like the column he leaned against, part of the structure, but not the scene. Lauren Green, seated in the fifth row near the center aisle, continued to glance back every so often. She had tried to refocus on the ceremony, on her niece's row, on the polished voice of the master of ceremonies listing accolades and awards, but her attention drifted again and again toward the edge of the courtyard. Something about the man standing there unsettled her, not in fear, but in awareness. He didn't seem lost. He didn't seem confused. He looked like he was waiting, not for instructions, but for permission to exist in a space that had quietly told him not today. Closer to the stage, in the third row, the 6 men in dark suits had not moved. Their attention had not wavered. One of them, a tall man with a closely trimmed beard and a scar barely visible near his temple, adjusted his tie slowly, then resumed his watch. The others shifted just slightly in their seats, exchanging brief looks, no words, no signals, but enough to confirm what each already knew. The man standing alone had been seen, and that mattered. The sun crept higher. A breeze fluttered the edge of the stage banner. More names were read aloud. Graduates stepped forward in turn, accepting diplomas with brief nods or wide grins. Somewhere in the rear seating section, a baby cried and was quickly hushed. An older man coughed loudly and didn't apologize. Life moved on around Thomas, but he remained the only figure unmoved. Then, through the crowd, a pair of staffers approached. One wore the standard college polo and khakis. The other had a lanyard with credentials and a radio clipped to his belt. They walked with purpose, cutting through the flow of guests like men with a task to complete. They stopped several feet from Thomas and conferred in low voices before one of them stepped forward. Thomas turned toward them slightly, calmly. He pulled the letter from his coat pocket and offered it again. The gesture was gentle, unhurried. The letter was worn now from travel and handling. The fold softened, the ink slightly faded, but the words still showed through clearly, even from a distance. The staffer didn't take it. He glanced at it, then at Thomas, then at the crowd behind him. With an apologetic posture but firm tone, he pointed toward the rear, a gesture that said, "You cannot stay here, not in this place, not like this." Thomas did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply returned the letter to his pocket and stood his ground. His eyes drifted back to the stage. One of the men took a step closer and quietly reached for his radio. His thumb hovered over the button. From the side of the field, another security official began making his way toward the column. The surrounding crowd remained unaware. The announcer called another name. Applause filled the air again. A small cluster of students threw confetti. In the middle of all this celebration, a man who had come for a single seat now stood under quiet pressure to leave. Still, he made no move to retreat. Lauren sat forward slightly in her chair. Her fingers tightened around her program. She had the growing feeling she was witnessing something that most others were missing, a subtle injustice unfolding, invisible unless you were looking for it. Back in the third row, the 6 men remained seated but no longer relaxed. Their bodies leaned forward just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to signal that their waiting might soon become something more. Their eyes, previously sweeping the crowd in arcs, were now locked on the cluster forming near the edge of the event. The buzz of the microphone faded into ambient noise. A name was mispronounced on stage. Laughter scattered across the rows, but not from everyone. A man stood holding nothing but memory and a letter from his son, while the world around him paused only briefly, long enough to glance, but not long enough to see. And yet something unseen had already begun to shift. The tension that had been quietly building around the edge of the courtyard did not go unnoticed by everyone. While most of the guests remained caught in the celebration, names, applause, flashbulbs, there were others who understood when silence meant more than noise. The 6 men seated in the third row had been watching with the kind of focus that comes from experience, not curiosity. They had waited long enough. The first to rise was the one with the scar near his temple. He stood slowly, with the steady precision of someone for whom standing wasn't just a physical action, it was a statement. His movements drew little attention at first. The crowd around him continued clapping for a student who had just received her degree in psychology. A moment later, the second man stood, then the third. By the time all 6 were upright, the ripple had begun. Not loud, not frantic, just undeniable. They said nothing to one another. They didn't have to. These men shared a language without words, built in fire, tested in sand, and carried home in silence. They moved down the aisle, not rushed, not dramatic, but with purpose carved into every step. A few guests glanced toward them, uncertain. An usher briefly moved aside, unsure whether to intervene. In one of the men's hands, a leather pouch was opened. From it, he retrieved a silver badge, not a police shield, not a ceremonial pin, but a Special Forces challenge coin. The insignia gleamed faintly in the late morning light. It was never raised high, never flashed. It was simply there, enough for anyone who knew to understand what it meant. The six approached Thomas, who had not yet moved. His back remained straight, his gaze forward. He didn't flinch as they came to stand beside him. He didn't turn to greet them. He didn't have to. Each man took a place at his side, forming a loose but unmistakable line, not guarding, not protecting, acknowledging, echoing, standing not for him, but with him. From a distance, the image was striking. One older man, alone in posture but not in purpose, flanked silently by six figures who knew exactly who he was before the first word had ever been spoken. The staffers who had attempted to usher Thomas away now hesitated. The man with the radio lowered it slightly, thumb pulling back from the button. The second glanced toward the seated guests, unsure how to proceed. No one had planned for this moment. There was no protocol for what was happening, not in the manual, not in the script. In the audience, heads began to turn. Lauren was among the first to stand. She wasn't sure why, only that her body moved before her mind could catch up. Others followed, slowly at first, then in growing numbers. Conversations halted, phone screens dropped to lapse. Even the MC on stage paused mid-sentence, his eyes catching the movement and faltering as the words slipped from his tongue. The atmosphere shifted from festive to reverent. The lighthearted mood dissolved into stillness, the kind of stillness that doesn't need to be explained. It simply enters the space and stays. From behind the curtain, a young man stepped forward. He wore the cap and gown like all the others, but his face was taut with emotion. His name was already listed in the program, his achievements printed and framed, but none of that mattered now. Adam Andrews crossed the stage slowly, not in procession, not with his graduating class, but as if called by something older than schedule. In one hand, he carried a folded paper, creased from time and travel. In the other, nothing. He approached the podium, past the principal speaker, and stood alone at the center. He looked down at the page once, then closed his eyes briefly. When he looked back up, he set the paper aside. His hands gripped the edges of the podium as though steadying himself against the gravity of what he was about to say. Behind him, the banner of the university fluttered once in the breeze. Ahead of him, silence. In the corner of his vision, he saw the seven men now standing together, one of them, his father. He began to speak. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room was already listening, not just hearing, but listening. Not to another prepared speech, but to something real. He spoke of silence, of a man who had never told stories, who had never shown medals, who had never asked to be honored. A man who had done his duty and returned home quietly, content to live without explanation. He spoke of 2006 and a mission named Operation Sapporo Dawn, of a fire in the hills of Afghanistan, of a bunker collapse, of 5 men left inside, and of one who went back. He described how his father, wounded, disoriented under direct fire, had crawled into the flames and pulled each of them out one at a time, how no orders were given, no backup requested. Just one man making one impossible choice again and again until none were left behind. And then he pointed to the third row. He didn't name them. He didn't need to. Those who sat there knew. Those who had risen now stood taller. One of them placed a hand briefly over his heart. The crowd turned. The hush grew deeper. And suddenly, the man they had ignored, dismissed, or overlooked was no longer anonymous. Adam said that when he wrote the letter inviting his father, he hadn't known whether a seat would be offered. But he had hoped, because a man like that didn't need a reserved sign. He already had his place, in the memory of those who had followed him, in the silence of those who owed him their lives, and now, finally, in the eyes of everyone watching. The words that left Adam's mouth were quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal, but they moved through the auditorium like a wave. His story didn't come with dramatics. There were no exaggerated pauses, no lifted tones, just a steady voice and a son telling the truth the world had overlooked for too long. He spoke of growing up in a home without stories of glory. His father had never mentioned deployments, never spoke of medals, never displayed certificates or awards. There were no plaques on the wall, no uniforms behind glass. Instead, there had been discipline, stillness, and kindness, the kind that showed up without announcement. Morning started early. The coffee was strong. The words were few, but always well chosen. Adam had learned early on that his father carried something heavy, but never passed it to anyone else. He learned that silence wasn't absence. It was protection. It was sacrifice held tightly behind the ribs and never let out unless absolutely necessary. That silence followed his father into every room, every quiet glance, every nod instead of a speech. It followed him even now to this very courtyard, where he had been told, without being told, that he didn't belong. And yet he had come, not to be honored, not to be noticed, just to see his son walk across a stage. That was all. But Adam wasn't going to let the world forget. He recounted the details of Operation Sapporo Dawn. He had read the report in secret, after finding an old flash drive in the back of a drawer while helping his father move boxes from a leaky storage shed. It wasn't a classified mission anymore. The story had been debriefed, documented, and stored in some forgotten database. But what the file didn't say, what none of the official reports ever could, was what kind of man ran toward fire with no guarantee of making it out. The report stated, structure compromised, heavy casualties expected. Sergeant Thomas Andrews, team lead, self-initiated recovery of downed squad members during active combat and secondary explosion risk, recovered all 5 men. Sustained third-degree burns, shoulder fracture, and shrapnel injuries, refused medevac until team was secured. Adam paused as the weight of the words landed. He let them settle before continuing. He said that one of the men his father had carried out of that burning bunker was sitting in the audience. He didn't point directly. He simply turned his head and looked toward the third row. The man there nodded once, slowly, his expression unreadable. There was a shifting in the rows. Some people stood without knowing why, others reached for tissues. Several students lowered their phones, as if suddenly ashamed of having filmed earlier without understanding what they were seeing. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It had transformed into something sacred. Adam didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word landed heavier than applause ever could. He said that when he wrote his father the letter, the one he had placed in that envelope with the blue ink and uneven lines, he hadn't known whether anyone would let him sit near the front. There were rules, after all. Protocol, reserved sections, family badges, paperwork, credentials, the kind of invisible barriers that had always kept men like Thomas just outside the frame. But what Adam had known, what he had believed without question, was that his father had already earned that seat, not through titles or money or connections, but through something far more permanent. Memory, not his own, but the memory of 5 men who still woke up because of what Thomas had done. The memory of comrades who had seen him crawl through smoke and blood, carrying weight that didn't belong to him, and never setting it down, even years later. Adam told the audience that heroes don't always arrive with speeches. Sometimes they arrive on foot, quietly, without ceremony. Sometimes they stand by the exit while the rest of us look the other way. Sometimes they don't ask for a place because they're used to being told it isn't theirs. But when someone like that shows up, even if the list doesn't have their name, even if the usher turns them away, you stand. You make room. You remember. As he finished, he took one final look toward the back of the courtyard. His father stood exactly as he had an hour ago, straight, still, a letter in his pocket, a history in his bones. And in that moment, the space between stage and silence collapsed, because the truth had been spoken, and now it could not be ignored. Adam stepped away from the podium with slow, measured steps. He didn't return to the line of graduates. He didn't glance at the crowd. His direction was clear, fixed, singular. Every footfall on the temporary stage flooring echoed faintly, the kind of sound that no one noticed until the rest of the room stopped making noise. The auditorium was silent. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence that creeps in during pauses or forgotten lines. This was something else. This was recognition in its purest form, wordless, collective, and full. He descended the steps and walked the length of the aisle, not hurried, not hesitant. When he reached the far wall, his father stood as he had from the beginning, still, composed, hands behind his back. Thomas didn't reach out. He didn't shift. He simply waited. Adam stopped in front of him and raised his hand in a formal salute. The gesture was crisp, practiced, and full of reverence. He held it there, eyes locked with his father's. The weight of the moment rested in that space between them. No commands, no speeches, no medals, just honor. Thomas didn't return the salute. Instead, he stepped forward, placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder, and pulled him into a firm embrace. It was not dramatic, it wasn't long, but it was full. Two people surrounded by silence holding onto the one thing that still made sense. Behind them, the six men standing nearby raised their hands in unison. Each rendered a sharp salute, not to the stage, not to the institution, but to the man who had once pulled them from fire and carried them across time. The audience rose. No one called for it. No one instructed. They simply stood, one, by instinct more than imitation. There was no applause, just the sound of fabric shifting and shoes scuffing gently against pavement. Phones dropped to laps. Children fell quiet. Even the graduates, lined behind the stage, froze in their gowns. One of the six stepped forward, hand reaching into his coat. He pulled out a small silver coin, a challenge coin, engraved with a unit emblem and a line of text. He placed it in Thomas's open palm with quiet finality. No words were exchanged. The message was carved into the metal. They remember because you came back. Thomas closed his fingers around it slowly. The coin was warm from the man's hand, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight. He didn't look down at it. He just nodded once. Then Adam turned slightly and gestured toward the center aisle. Together, they began to walk. The same aisle Thomas had tried to approach earlier now cleared before them. People moved aside, some with bowed heads, others with eyes wide. No usher stood in their way. No placard denied them entry. The front row, once defined by tape and rules, was now wide open. They reached the section without resistance. The seats once reserved were now irrelevant. Adam waited until his father sat, then took the seat beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The entire field, the rows of guests, and even the dais felt smaller somehow, as if the spotlight had moved off the stage and settled where it belonged. The ceremony resumed, but the rhythm had changed. Names were still called, diplomas handed out, but the applause was softer, the smiles quieter. The energy that had once filled the air with celebration now hung heavier, with reverence, with reflection, with respect. When the final student walked across the stage and tassels were turned, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but Thomas remained seated. Guests passed him with brief nods. Graduates stopped to shake his hand, some offering words, others unable to speak. One young woman placed a folded paper in his lap, a photo she had printed on the spot. It showed Thomas standing alone by the column, before the moment when everything changed. He held the photo in his hands for a long time. The crowd thinned. The chairs were folded. A janitor began rolling up the sound cables. Adam stood nearby, talking with faculty, shaking hands, accepting congratulations he no longer needed. Eventually, he returned to his father's side. Thomas stood slowly. The letter still rested in the inside pocket of his coat. He reached for it now, unfolded it carefully as if the paper might tear under the weight of the moment. He read it one last time. "Dad, I want you in the front row." And now finally he had been, not because of a badge, not because someone waved him through, but because someone remembered what mattered. He slipped the letter back into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the coin. Two small things, but they had changed everything. As he walked toward the exit with his son at his side, the sky above had begun to shift. A few early rays of afternoon light cut through the thinning clouds. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was promise. And for the first time that day, Thomas Andrews allowed himself the faintest smile, not for recognition, but for being seen.